In the scientific world, getting published in an elite, peer-reviewed medical journal like the Lancet is the ultimate flex. It tells the world that your study can be trusted and implemented into everyday life. This is how doctors decide how to treat you and how global health policies get written. So, when a study comes out claiming something catastrophic, society tends to listen. Usually, when scientific studies go wrong, it's an honest flaw. A weak study design, bad sampling, or statistical errors. But what happens when the science isn't just flawed? What if it's fabricated? What if a researcher isn't searching for truth, but is being wired hundreds of thousands of pounds by a personal injury lawyer to manufacture evidence for a multi-million-dollar lawsuit? And what if that same researcher has skin in the game and a huge conflict of interest? Well, they get caught. Eventually. But here's the thing. A prestigious, peer-reviewed journal reaches millions overnight. And while a study can be retracted, the damage is already done. That debunked study can go on to live its best life in conspiracy boards, parenting groups, and wellness spaces forever, thanks to the internet. I'm Nicole, and this is Great in the Sack, when misogyny leads to mayhem. Today, we're talking about one of the most destructive cases of medical fraud in modern history, how it supercharged the anti-vax movement, and how that movement has merged into modern wellness culture, and sometimes straight into the far right. Hi! Today we're taking a brief side quest before closing out the final episode in our Afghan series. So I've been thinking about this whole anti-vaxxer phenomenon for a long time, partly because of my own relationship with neurodiversity within myself and my family. Our main sources today are Brian Deere's investigative series, The Secrets of the MMR Scare, and Gabe Mithen's breakdown of Ulrich Beck in A Critical Introduction to the Risk Society, along with our other sources, which are linked in the show notes. And if you're wondering where misogyny and patriarchy fit into vaccine panic, don't worry, we'll get there. Now, have you guys ever heard of the sociological concept called the Risk Society? There's two main thinkers here. The first is British sociologist Anthony Giddens. And his thing is how we moved from traditional societies, where the only concept of time was the sunrise and the church bells, and disasters were chalked up to fate or God, into now, which he calls late modernity. He says that modern society runs on massive, abstract systems, which include symbolic tokens like time and currency, as well as expert systems like medicine and modern science. Giddens points out that we are fundamentally dependent on these systems, especially the expert systems, just to survive. But because science is constantly revising itself and experts disagree, we live in constant anxiety, trying to calculate and prepare for risks, to try to predict a future that we really can't fully control. And then there's the German sociologist Ulrich Beck, whose take is a bit darker. Beck argues that our biggest threats are no longer natural hazards like floods or drought. They're manufactured risks, dangers created by techno-industrial progress itself, like toxic pollution, nuclear meltdowns, and climate change. And the paradox that Beck highlights is that the same institutions and experts that created these modern side effects are the very ones telling us, hey, don't worry, we tested everything and it's safe. When institutions inevitably mess up, cover things up, or contradict each other, institutional trust becomes fragile. This leaves some people feeling vulnerable and unsafe. And when people are desperate for safety in an uncertain world, a charismatic doctor can come in and wreak havoc on these expert systems as a bad actor, looking out for their own interests and posing as a savior to those desperate people who have lost trust in the institutions. So I just wanted to frame this episode by first explaining these two versions of risk society, because it feels so relevant to what we're about to discuss. Y'all know sociology is my jam. Now, the history of vaccines is pretty wild. The practice of protecting people from diseases through inoculation actually has ancient roots, with records dating back to at least the 10th century in China. During that time, doctors would grind up smallpox scabs and have patients snort them, a practice which can be explained as a type of early variolation that made a form of immunity, though it remained highly risky, as about 3 to 5 out of 100 patients died from the treatment itself. By the 1720s, the early practice of variolation was introduced in both the UK and the American colonies. This didn't involve snorting scabs, but it was still pretty brutal, and it received immediate opposition. For example, in 1722, English Reverend Edmund Massey preached a sermon calling inoculation a diabolical operation, and argued that bypassing diseases was a most sinful act of defiance against God, who sent plagues as divine retribution and intervention. I mean, if you think about it, the cure for everything back then was to just pray harder, and now science wants to come in and play God? And by the way, the crazy side story of variolation in the American colonies is that a man who was heavily involved in the witch hunts in Salem was responsible for bringing variolation there 20 years later. That's right, friend of the pod Cotton Mather, the firm believer in spectral evidence, which was responsible for the direct execution of 14 women, was later gifted a slave who told him about a process they did in Africa called grafting, aka variolation. Mather used that information during the 1721 smallpox crisis for a variolation drive in Salem. Anyway, the modern era of vaccination, and some may argue the very field of medicine itself, officially began in 1796 with British doctor Edward Jenner. Jenner noticed that milkmaids seemed uniquely immune to smallpox. He hypothesized that their prior exposure to cowpox, a related but far milder and less dangerous virus, provided this protection. To test this, he famously inoculated an 8-year-old child with fluid taken from a milkmaid's cowpox sore, and subsequently demonstrated the boy's immunity to smallpox, and he named the procedure after the Latin word for cow, vacca. Early vaccination was super unpleasant and primitive. It involved scoring the skin of a patient's arm with a needle or lancet and dabbing on live cowpox virus that had been collected from the sores of infected calves. Ugh. The virus would produce a painful lesion, a temporary flu-like illness, and leave a permanent scar. It wasn't until later that heat-stable versions of the smallpox vaccine were developed, which finally eliminated many of these severe side effects. Nevertheless, Jenner's breakthrough laid the foundation for modern Western immunology. Now, opposition to vaccination has pretty much existed since there were vaccinations. Keep in mind that early medicine was basically like what I would call do-it-yourself, trial and error, vibes-based work. I mean, barbers were doctors, mainly because they possessed razors which could be used for surgery. So, faith in medicine was pretty rocky in the beginning. But still, even with the bloodletting and mercury treatments, there was still some trust in it. Illness back then was seen as an act of God, after all. And people had faith in that local barber of theirs to amputate their leg. But then medicine began to evolve, just as areas over the world began industrializing. And the risks surrounding this field was now created by human technology. It began to carry more authority. So when the UK government passed the Vaccination Acts of 1840, 1853, and 1871, making infant smallpox vaccination free and eventually mandatory, public backlash grew immediately. Critics formed anti-vaccination leagues and printed little pamphlets with sensational Gothic titles like "Vaccination, a Curse," while early caricatures depicted vaccinated citizens literally turning into cows. To top it all off, early manufacturing was imperfect, and catastrophic errors occurred. Most famously during the American Civil War, when 5,000 Confederate soldiers under Robert E. Lee were rendered combat ineffective because a doctor accidentally used vaccine material contaminated with syphilis. Yikes. Maybe he was working for the Union undercover. A noteworthy historical example of vaccine resistance occurred in Stockholm, Sweden, in 1873, where intense vaccine skepticism left only 40% of the city's population vaccinated against smallpox, compared to 90% in the rest of the country. This skepticism was abruptly broken, though, in 1874, when a massive smallpox outbreak devastated Stockholm, causing a death toll 10 times higher than the rest of the country and prompting a sharp rise in voluntary immunizations. At the turn of the 20th century, it's not like compulsory vaccination was enforced through school enrollment paperwork like today. It was carried out by quasi-military state health departments using extreme authoritarian physical force. Health officers frequently handcuffed resistors, literally held citizens at gunpoint to inject them, and burned down the homes of poor families under the guise of sterilizing smallpox-exposed residences. And as you might be able to imagine, more right-wing local governments routinely used smallpox outbreaks as excuses to racially oppress Black communities even further, quarantining entire Black neighborhoods and forcing Black workers off vessels with clubs, for fuck's sake, to inject them against their will. The villainization of Black people during smallpox outbreaks and early vaccination campaigns was, of course, deeply rooted in systemic racism and institutional neglect, which allowed for the weaponization of public health as a tool of terror. When a milder, less deadly strain of smallpox began racing through the American South in the late 1890s, white communities quickly racialized it to completely avoid taking any public health precautions. I mean, it's much easier and cheaper to just blame the people you consider to be other. Because this strain had a reputation for supposedly infecting, quote, and I'm sorry, none but Negroes, it was widely referred to by white Americans by highly offensive nicknames, including, but far from limited to, the N-word itch. It was also paired with xenophobic names, which could easily be interchanged with other ethnicities to continue shifting the blame to everyone else. Hate this. The myth that Black people were the primary vectors of the disease was reinforced by the fact that Black minstrel shows traveled extensively through the South. Because they traveled, these performers were structurally more vulnerable to contracting and spreading the virus, but white communities ignored this correlation and used it to argue that Black people were inherently, quote, filthy and bringing disease to white towns. And because white municipal governments and local media largely ignored smallpox outbreaks as long as the cases were confined to Black neighborhoods, the virus spread uncontained until it did cross into white communities. Public health officials deflected criticism from their own delayed responses by once again blaming Black populations and ordering surveillance and targeted vaccination of Black residents. Local authorities implemented racially selective quarantines and placed infected individuals into substandard isolation facilities, referred to as pox houses, prompting families to conceal sick relatives. Public health measures were frequently enforced by armed officers through forced vaccinations, property fumigation with sulfur smoke, and sometimes even burning down homes. Similar forcible methods were documented internationally too, such as in Panama, where arriving Black laborers were physically coerced into receiving vaccinations. Now, listen to how bonkers this is. Around this time, the American anti-vaccine movement was largely driven by a progressive, affluent, left-wing coalition. Now, why these progressive reformers held this stance is a super complex historical struggle over civil liberties, bodily autonomy, and institutional violence. These left-wing progressives actively rebelled against this state-sanctioned violence. Famous abolitionist Frederick Douglass stood firmly against compulsory vaccination, arguing that mandatory injections were a dangerous encroachment on personal freedom of choice in the face of such violent enforcement. The core ideology behind the early American anti-vaccine movement was a progressive intellectual tradition known as libertarian radicalism. Unlike modern economic libertarians, these reformers focused strictly on social justice and human rights. The exact same individuals who championed women's suffrage, anti-imperialism, anti-racism, and vegetarianism also formed the backbone of the anti-vaccine leagues. Laura Little, an activist who blamed the smallpox vaccine for her 7-year-old son's death, edited an influential anti-vaccine journal called The Liberator, and she named it explicitly after the famous pre-Civil War abolitionist newspaper, because she viewed the anti-vaccination fight as a direct continuation of the struggle for human liberty. Global progressive icons shared this skepticism. Russian author Leo Tolstoy supported the anti-vaccine cause as a fundamental fight for personal liberty, while socialist playwright George Bernard Shaw famously mocked vaccination as a, quote, peculiarly filthy piece of witchcraft. So, all of this helps us understand the reasoning for anti-vax sentiment around the turn of the 20th century. It was pretty fucking dangerous, and the enforcement of it was horrifying and authoritarian at best. Also, the left's fear of state-mandated medical procedures proved to be tragically accurate, because in the 1910s and 1920s, another repeat character of the pod, the American eugenics movement, began forcibly sterilizing tens of thousands of citizens. In a dark plot twist, the primary legal precedent cited to justify these forced eugenic sterilizations was compulsory vaccination. This institutional violence was especially justified in the eyes of the state by the landmark 1905 vaccination case, Jacobson versus Massachusetts. In this case, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that states have the, quote, police power to enforce public health measures, like compulsory vaccination, to protect the general safety and welfare of citizens, provided that there are reasonable exceptions, for example, medical unfitness. And of course, eugenics proponents argued that if the state could force vaccination for public good, it had the right to control their reproductive organs too. I mean, hey, what's the difference? That escalated quickly. After all this, the anti-vaccine movement largely went dormant for several decades. This was because of drastically improved safety and the post-war golden age of science. Vaccines became far more sophisticated, standardized, and less of a pain in the ass than the primitive cowpox scoring methods of the 19th century. By the 1950s, medical triumphs, most notably the polio vaccine, germ theory, and those heat-stable versions of the smallpox vaccine I mentioned earlier, reinvigorated public faith in those expert systems. Science and the progressive safety state were widely seen as engines of social progress. Armed with these tools, the WHO declared smallpox completely eradicated by 1980, and polio was eliminated in the Americas by 1994. The modern era of vaccine panic officially broke out in the mid-1970s, with controversies surrounding the DTP, diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis vaccine. This was the first time the vaccine resistance shifted from political objections like bodily autonomy to fears regarding neurological damage in children. In 1974, a report from the Great Ormond Street Hospital for Sick Children in London alleged that 36 children had suffered severe neurological conditions following the DTP immunization. Media coverage sparked a massive drop in vaccination rates, resulting in 3 major deadly whooping cough epidemics. It took a massive, multi-year epidemiological study called the National Childhood Encephalopathy Study, that's a mouthful, to prove the actual risk of neurological damage was incredibly low, and to restore public confidence. The panic flared up in 1982 with the broadcast of a highly sensationalized television documentary that aired in the United States called DPT, Vaccine Roulette. It did what legacy media always does, and dramatized side effects while downplaying the vaccine's benefits. Angry parents formed victim advocacy groups, culminating in a wave of lawsuits against vaccine manufacturers. While this panic had a smaller impact on overall immunization rates than in the UK when their panic happened, the litigation caused vaccine prices to skyrocket and forced several pharmaceutical companies to stop manufacturing the DTP shot entirely. As the 20th century drew to a close, a series of regulatory and environmental failures began to erode some of the public's trust in expert systems, which Giddens stressed that people must continue to maintain because we ourselves are not experts. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, the British government consistently lied to the public by denying a link between mad cow disease in cattle and variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease in humans. There is a famous image of the UK Environment Minister feeding a hamburger to his 4-year-old daughter to prove it was safe, only for the government to admit that there was a connection between the two diseases in 1996, which really betrayed the public's belief in institutional integrity. And just as the sociologists Ulrich Beck and Anthony Giddens had noted, as institutions lost their monopoly on truth, science would begin to turn inward and publicly contradict itself. Distrust in the alliance of government, regulatory boards, and pharmaceutical companies meant the burden of basically risk assessment was placed directly onto individuals. Many parents, feeling hypervigilant, began to view themselves as private alternative experts. They began obsessing over what went into their children's bodies, leading to intense anxieties over vaccine ingredients. Most notably, thimerosal, a mercury-containing preservative used in multi-dose vials. By the late 1990s, the stage was perfectly set for a counter-expert, the bad actor who made his way into the vulnerable expert systems. Parents were deeply anxious, and now, primed to distrust the medical establishment, Andrew Wakefield has entered the chat. Now, just to get this out into the open, Wakefield wasn't actually an autism expert. He was a British gastroenterologist. In the early 1990s, he published some papers suggesting that the measles virus might cause Crohn's disease. That got him a little bit of professional spotlight. So in 1995, he went further, publishing a paper claiming the measles vaccine might cause Crohn's. That took a turn. It was a theory desperately looking for a home, and it found one when he was approached by a parent of an autistic child who was searching for answers regarding her son's severe stomach issues. And with this, Wakefield saw an opportunity. He realized that many autistic children suffer from chronic bowel issues, and he decided to invent a brand new, completely manufactured syndrome that linked the two. He called it autistic enterocolitis. Wakefield's core theory was that the damaged, inflamed colon, what is commonly referred to in health and wellness circles as leaky gut, could no longer filter out harmful peptides and proteins. Instead, these toxins, supposedly leaked through the intestinal wall, entered the bloodstream and traveled to the brain, where they damaged developing neurons and caused regressive autism. And just to be clear, regressive autism isn't as common as classical autism. It makes up about 30% of autism diagnoses. With regressive autism, a child can go and hit all their milestones, begin feeding themselves and speaking, and then they start regressing. And look, as a parent of a child with moderate needs who has autism, I get it. A doctor offering a pretty clear explanation for your child's suffering, which would allow you to have a direct entity to blame instead of wondering, but how, would be the most validating thing you can imagine. I mean, you could instantly shift blame to Big Pharma. This explanation would be especially influential if you're feeling alone and isolated while you're caring for your child, who society may see as broken. People don't often talk about the automatic shame moms feel when raising a child seen as different. You have to make some adjustments to your life and have some time to remap and adapt to a different future than you originally envisioned. And this journey is a difficult one. Some families stay in denial and keep searching for somewhere to place blame. Anyway, as I said in the beginning of the episode, what Wakefield did wasn't some honest, righteous endeavor. It was an elaborate, predatory scheme. Andrew Wakefield was not searching for the truth. He was searching for money and fame. You see, 2 years before his paper was even published in the Lancet, Wakefield was secretly being paid by a personal injury lawyer named Richard Barr. Barr represented families who believed their children had been harmed by the MMR vaccine and was trying to build a massive, multi-million-dollar class action lawsuit against vaccine manufacturers. He paid Wakefield an undisclosed fee of £150 an hour, which eventually totaled over £435,000. In today's economy, that translates to around £1 million. That's 1.4 million in USD. In fact, before a single child in the study was ever clinically investigated, Wakefield and Barr wrote a confidential grant application to the UK Legal Aid Board, explicitly stating their goal was to find a vaccine-induced pathology to win their court case. Now, in the world of ethical research, you never begin a study with a goal. In fact, you start out with something referred to as null hypothesis. The null hypothesis means basically innocent until proven guilty. You begin with the default assumption that there is no effect or connection, and let the data speak for itself. There is also this other massive undisclosed conflict of interest. 8 months before his paper came out, Wakefield filed a patent for a competing single-dose measles vaccine. He drew up a secret business scheme, including companies called Carmel Healthcare Limited, named after his wife, and Immunospecifics Biotechnologies Limited, that he predicted would make up to £72.5 million a year, that's $43 million, selling diagnostic kits and alternative single vaccines. But of course, to make his scheme work, he first had to damage public trust in the combined MMR shot. So in reality, he wasn't even anti-vax. He was just pro-Wakefield and pro-wealth. Now, you might be asking, how did he manufacture the proof for his study? Well, he gathered a small group of 12 children, a normal amount if you're trying to show that some type of correlation between variables exists. The paper claimed that the children were, quote, consecutively referred to the hospital, but the lie detector test determined that that was a lie. They were handpicked and sent his way by anti-MMR campaigning groups and that lawyer Richard Barr. He then completely falsified the medical data to fit his narrative. He claimed all 12 children were, quote, previously normal before their MMR shot. In reality, though, 5 of them had documented pre-existing developmental delays, neurological concerns, or genetic disorders like Fragile X syndrome, which were recorded before they ever got vaccinated. One child, child 11, had clear developmental milestones slipping months before his MMR shot. Now, to prove the vaccine caused the autism, he needed a really tight timeline. He claimed symptoms started an average of 6.3 days after vaccination. In reality, several children had symptoms starting months later, but Wakefield simply excluded those families' claims or altered the records to make the 14-day window look perfect. He even called parents at home before their clinical visits, suggestively coaching their timelines. He claimed 9 of the 12 children had regressive autism, but medical records showed 3 of those kids didn't even have an autism diagnosis. One had Asperger's, another had a simple language impairment, and the hospital registrar explicitly wrote of another child that he is, quote, not thought to have features of autism, end quote. Only one child in the entire study actually had classic regressive autism. To prove his enterocolitis bowel-to-brain link, he needed inflamed colons. The hospital's pathologists examined the children's biopsies and found that their colons were completely normal. But 3 months after the children were discharged, senior clinician John Walker Smith and Wakefield recalled the records and manually altered the normal findings to read as nonspecific colitis in the published paper. Conversely, he completely hid the fact that the children's most consistent symptom was severe chronic constipation, the exact opposite of inflammatory bowel disease. But I mean, the fraud goes far beyond cheating a study. It crosses into literal medical abuse of children. Under the guise of research, Wakefield and Walker Smith had subjected these highly vulnerable children to an array of incredibly painful, invasive, and completely unnecessary procedures. They ran colonoscopies, colon biopsies, as I mentioned before, barium meals, and even lumbar punctures. You know, spinal taps, on kids who had absolutely no clinical need for them. They did this without proper approval from the ethics board, which had explicitly banned experimental testing. It was so brutal that the nurses were driven to leave the unit. The General Medical Council later ruled that Wakefield acted with a, quote, callous disregard for the pain and suffering of these children, treating them like literal guinea pigs. Oh yeah, and also, to get a control group of healthy children who didn't have autism, Wakefield bribed children at his son's 10th birthday party with £5 each to let him draw their blood. In a video from a 1999 conference, he can be seen laughing and joking to an audience about how kids fainted and threw up all over their mothers while he took their blood. As he laughed, he said, "Next year, they'll want £10. The sheer sociopathy of this guy is fucking shocking. Wakefield managed to get his rigged 12-person case study published in the Lancet, but the paper itself only claimed to observe a correlation. It never proved causation. And that was normal procedure. Publish preliminary observations, then do larger studies to try to prove causality. But Wakefield had zero interest in doing the science part. In a televised 23-minute video news release at his hospital's press conference, Wakefield went rogue, stepping away from his co-author's cautious wording of this small study and telling the public that there was, quote, sufficient anxiety in his mind to warrant suspending the triple MMR vaccine in favor of separate single-dose shots, one of which, the measles single-dose shot, he held a patent on and was trying to monetize. The tabloids, of course, created a frenzy of panic, and MMR vaccination rates in the UK collapsed from over 90% down to under 80% and as low as 54% in some areas. Measles came back hard, leading to thousands of infections, severe complications, and the first childhood deaths in decades. And the amount of time he got away with it is just unbelievable. It took 6 years, 2004, for investigative journalist Brian Deere to finally expose the financial conflicts of interest, causing 10 of Wakefield's 12 co-authors to immediately retract their support. It took 12 years, until February 2010, for the Lancet to retract the paper altogether. And only after the longest medical disciplinary hearing in British history, even up to today, spanning 217 days, did the General Medical Council finally strip Wakefield of his medical license in May 2010. 12 whole years. But again, the damage was already done. Wakefield fled to Austin, Texas, and reinvented himself as a persecuted, heroic martyr, silenced by Big Pharma and the corrupt medical establishment. You see, when public trust in the expert systems of medicine become strained and damaged, people themselves are left to manage the risks of healthcare. Some don't handle it so well, as is super obvious in the present day. And under a patriarchal society, that heavy burden falls hard as fuck on mothers, paving a direct road from vaccine skepticism straight into the modern wellness pipeline and the tradwife lifestyle. So, in Texas, Wakefield started directing anti-vaccine propaganda films like Vaxxed in 2016, making himself seen on the media circuit. To his followers, he wasn't a charlatan who got caught, but instead, a brave whistleblower who was being silenced. He built an intensely loyal army of followers. And how did he do it? Misogyny. He built his entire narrative around the mother's intuition versus the corrupt medical establishment. He used what is referred to as medical populism. So, we know that mothers historically handle the vast majority of pediatric appointments, which means they are targeted by default for anti-vax messaging. But Wakefield specifically used mothers as his primary data source to validate his nonsense. He would use the fact that the MMR shot is given at 12 to 15 months, which is the exact developmental window when autism symptoms naturally become visible. And he looked at those mothers straight in the eye and told them, "You're right. It was the vaccine. The medical system did this to your child." And while men can also be anti-vaxxers, of course, research shows that it's usually for different reasons, more often due to anti-government sentiments, while when women are anti-vaxxers, it is more often due to intense anxiety over child safety and chemical purity, which is exactly what Wakefield preyed on. In his media campaigns, he heavily relied on slogans like, "No one will ever love you as much as your mother." And he repeatedly told his audiences to, quote, "trust your mother's intuition." Now, back in the 50s and 60s, psychology blamed autism on what some clown psychologist named Bethlehem called refrigerator mothers. The sexist idea that cold, unloving mothers caused their children's neurodivergence. And Andrew Wakefield revived this old trope by basically putting the shame and responsibility of a child's diagnosis onto moms, basically telling them, if you take your child to get this vaccine, you are actively choosing to inject them with something that could destroy their brain. By shifting this burden of safety completely onto the individual mother's choices, he induced a kind of maternal panic. The messaging here is that if a mother complies with the state and listens to her doctor, she's a bad mom who poisoned her baby. If she resists, she's a hero protecting her baby. Wakefield weaponized maternal guilt to completely isolate women. And the anti-vax movement has perfected this playbook. Researchers studying the Disinformation Dozen, the tiny group of influencers responsible for 65% of the anti-vaccine content online, found that they specifically target moms by hijacking hegemonic ideals of the good mother. They push the aesthetic of the protective mother, the intuitive mother, and the doting mother. Their content tells women to trust their gut over professional medical knowledge, using hashtags like #MotherKnowsBest in an attempt to pit maternal instinct against science. It's so fucking nefarious. It's so dark that these networks actively hunt for grieving mothers whose babies have tragically died from sudden infant death syndrome or accidental suffocation while co-sleeping. They swarm these heartbroken women online, telling them the vaccines did it and convincing them to become crusaders for the movement. And it's a brilliantly hideous strategy because who's going to publicly attack a grieving mother? They use these women like human shields for their movement. I mean, if you're a mom and you've been convinced that the expert systems, aka the doctors, the schools, the government, are all trying to poison your family, what do? You go online, maybe looking for purity, clean eating, healthy living, and you fall right into the health and wellness spaces. What might start as a perfectly reasonable desire to feed your kids organic food or do yoga to de-stress during a pandemic can slowly blend into more and more extreme content thanks to the algorithm gods. You start following wellness influencers like former celebrity chef Pete Evans, who built his brand selling paleo diets and activated almonds, which I had to look up, by the way. It's not worth looking up, I promise. It's stupid. But suddenly, the aesthetic of natural living begins to merge with more paranoid content. You might see videos of Evans calling COVID a scam, posting QAnon conspiracies, and eventually sharing cartoons with literal neo-Nazi symbols on them. This particular pipeline is what researchers refer to as the conspirituality pipeline, which is the collision of the female-dominated New Age wellness space with the male-dominated right-wing realm of conspiracy theories. Just underneath those pastel Instagram filters and juice cleansers is a deeply paranoid, far-right ideology that tells women the only way to be safe is to reject all of society's institutions. And at the very end of this dark tunnel is the ultimate patriarchal trap, the tradwife lifestyle. If the outside world is toxic, schools are brainwashing your kids, and doctors are poisoning your babies, I guess for some, the only logical conclusion to that is to retreat entirely into the home. The tradwife aesthetic promises young women a safe harbor. It tells them, don't worry about college or a job. Live a simpler life. Let a man be your provider and protector. Just focus on making sourdough bread, avoiding seed oils, and raising pure babies. But as we've seen, through content spreading over social media of former tradwives, this is actually taking the ultimate risk within the risk society that we're living in. When you trade institutional risk for, quote, patriarchal protection, you strip yourself of every single bit of autonomy you possess. You end up with no credit history, no resume, and zero financial independence. And if that fairy tale ends, and it often does, the man might become abusive, lose his job, or straight up leave. You're left with absolutely nothing. There's actually a clinical term for a divorced tradwife. It's called a displaced homemaker. And the statistics are pretty horrifying. Less than 40% of child support ever gets paid after the split. Also, the number one risk factor for domestic violence is financial dependence on your partner. Financial abuse is real as fuck. One former tradwife named Jenny Gage, who ended up sleeping in her car in a Walmart parking lot with her kids, put it like this: a man is not a plan. And this is the most tragic part of the anti-vax/wellness space to far-right pipeline. In a desperate attempt to protect their children from the perceived risks of modern medicine, these women, who are often very young, can be manipulated into willingly stepping into the very real risk of total economic and patriarchal subjugation. Does everyone go all the way to the end of the pipeline? No, of course not. There are different entryways in, and naturally, not all people go all the way to the most extreme end. But looking at this from a broader sociological standpoint, it's important to understand why certain individuals are vulnerable to falling completely into this dogmatic way of thinking, and why it's so difficult to pull them out. From a logical perspective, the statistical risks associated with modern medicine, like vaccines, are incredibly low. But facts and statistics are generally ineffective at pulling people out of this pipeline because the movement is driven by emotion or affect rather than data. Narratives that use highly emotional language leave a much deeper psychological impression than objective statistics. Once an individual adopts these alternative beliefs, presenting them with undeniable, fact-based evidence usually triggers cognitive dissonance, which means a state of psychological discomfort caused by holding two conflicting ideas at once. To reduce this discomfort, individuals will engage in something called motivated reasoning and commitment bias, which is the human tendency to adhere to a chosen position regardless of challenging information. Instead of changing their minds, people often double down and selectively ignore facts that contradict their worldview to protect their established beliefs. Also, if we want to understand why people go to the extreme end of this pipeline, we have to look back at Ulrich Beck's concept of the risk society. In the modern era, individuals are surrounded by manufactured risks, hazards created by industrialization, science, and modern institutions. Because these same institutions are the ones responsible for managing the risks, people experience a profound sense of institutional fatigue and feelings of a loss of control. When individuals feel that the modern world is an unmanageable clusterfuck of toxic, manufactured risks, retreating from society entirely begins to look more and more appealing, rational even. Sociologically speaking, this seems like a coping mechanism for the overwhelming anxieties of modern life. However, this search for safety ends in a tragically ironic way. By attempting to escape the statistically low risks of modern institutions, these individuals willingly adopt a lifestyle that strips away their autonomy. Because, again, retreating from modern society in these different ways means a person often forfeits higher education, a resume, credit history, and personal income. And when that patriarchal safety net fails, for any different reason, divorce, death, disability, abuse, they're left completely destitute. And look, I want to be super clear here. Understanding why people fall into these dogmatic ways of thinking is not the same as condoning the outcome. Having empathy for someone's fears is not an endorsement of their conspiracy theories. Because, as we all know, institutional distrust didn't just appear out of thin air. Abstract systems fail us all the time. Governments lie. Institutions lie. We have seen egregious abuses within the scientific and medical establishments. Take Carlton Giddens, a Nobel-winning virologist studying Kourou and Papua New Guinea, who used his elite credentials to sexually abuse indigenous children for decades, knowing the geographic and structural power dynamics would protect him. Peter Dalgleish was a humanitarian worker and a UN official who was convicted of sexually abusing children in Nepal while he was supposed to be helping them. Noam Chomsky built his entire legacy on exposing systemic corruption and holding powerful figures accountable, was in the Epstein files. And speaking of the Epstein files, we see the President of the United States of America claim he's going to drain the swamp while actively exploiting the state for his own power. When bad actors operate inside expert systems, the betrayal feels enormous and pervasive. So, yeah, the feelings of distrust makes sense. But burning the entire concept of science to the ground isn't the answer. This is where I want to talk about what Anthony Giddens calls active trust. Now, passive trust is when you blindly swallow whatever an authority figure tells you without a second thought. But blind cynicism, rejecting all established science just to accept whatever unverified nonsense an influencer or wellness guru feeds you, is just another form of passivity. Active trust requires real work. It means acknowledging that because we aren't all virologists, epidemiologists, or engineers, we need expert systems to navigate modern life. But we have to engage with them using rigorous critical thinking. It's vital in today's world to learn how to evaluate evidence, understand the difference between correlation and causation, and hold institutions accountable without abandoning the scientific community itself. This concludes my side quest. What did you guys think about this episode? Did you enjoy the analysis of sociological concepts, or was it boring for you? Next episode, we'll return with the final installment of the Afghan series. Please, please, please follow the show and rate it if you have time. As always, stay vigilant, stay vocal, because silence is complicity. See you next time.